Well, no, I've always found, you know, that there's a lot of energy in your stories, and it's clear that you're having a good time and that you are amused. Do you then, because the way the story's growing, do you then tend to write sequentially rather than writing scenes and then sort of stitching them all together?
Yeah, I write very sequentially. I start at the beginning. What I'll do is I'll start, and if I have things in mind, I'll I jot them all down. And then they all sort of find their place as I get to them. Like, this will probably come later on, you know, and I'm not sure what happens up to that point, but when I get there, that'll be waiting. And then I sort of find out the path to get to this next thing. But it's not a complete chapter. It's an idea, you know.
Right.
There was a scene in Aunt Dimity Takes a Holiday. I mean, the scene that inspired the book was that there were two scenes, and that was all I knew about the book when I started. There were two scenes. One was Laurie and Bill pulling up to this gracious, stately home and having the shrubbery on fire at night. And that scene and I didn't know why it was on fire. I just thought it looked great in my head. I just saw that, the way the light would reflect on the reflecting pool and light the front of this stately home. It just was very intriguing to me. And I knew that Laurie would sort of say, is that supposed to be happening? Are they welcoming us, or is that a fire? So it was funny, too. And then the other scene is a very passionate scene between Nell and Kit when she's injured and he comes to see her. And that just, I'm a sucker for that. I'm a sucker for anything between Kit and Nell. I love their relationship. And that I knew it was going to be in the book. I didn't know why, you know, I didn't know how, I didn't know what had happened to put them in that situation. But I loved that, and I knew it would be in the book. And then the rest of the book sort of happened naturally between those two scenes. And they fit in. And it does create a state of excitement and interest that I couldn't replicate if I had to write it all down and get it all in order beforehand. I don't recommend it to anyone. You end up wasting a lot of paper and wasting some time, and I don't go off on dead ends anymore. I mean, I did that when I first started, but it's been a long time since then. So I don't go off so many. I mean, when I wrote Aunt Dimity and the Duke, I had about 800 pages of, you know, going off on side streets because they were interesting to me. I don't do that anymore. The main road is full of surprises, though, and I really enjoy it.
You know, we've mentioned various characters, but for readers who aren't familiar with your work, why don't we go back and introduce who they are?
Well, I don't know if I want to, because I also feel strongly that I impose my own standards on everyone else, that I don't want to know about a book before I read it, and I don't know if I should tell other people about my books. The reason for that is that when one reads a review of a book, the reviewer draws your attention to certain points because that's what they're commenting on. Automatically, when you read that book, your attention's going to be drawn to those, which means that you may not notice something that would have had meaning for you. You're sort of playing, you know, the Easter egg hunt when you read a review and then read a book, because you're automatically looking for those things the reviewer pointed out. If you read a book cold, it's amazing what is important to you, and then you go back to the reviewer and say, oh, well, I agree or disagree, but they didn't even notice all this other stuff that I picked up on. I had a woman write to me about one line in Aunt Dimity's death where Laurie Shepard, who is the main character in all of the stories, is working at a temp agency and has this hyper-energetic boss who's driving her crazy. And this woman, out of the whole book, that scene spoke to her because she had had this horrible hyper-energetic boss when she was working as a temp in a miserable part of her life. And no, that's not something a reviewer is going to grab. But for her, that was so important. And she just loved the book because of that, because I'd captured something from her life and reflected it back to her.
Well, I can't argue with you that there are a lot of over-reviewers out there, but I don't think it's going to blow the book to at least talk about Laurie and Bill and Reg and Aunt Dimity.
Well, no, not Aunt Dimity. Laurie Shepard is an American who inherits, well, she's not sure what she inherits in the first book, from her late mother's closest friend, who was a woman named Dimity Westwood, who was extremely wealthy. And the lawyers who are handling this situation are a father and son, Willis and Willis in Boston, and Bill Willis is the son, and he and Laurie end up falling in love and getting married in the process of the first book. There, I've given that away, although it's very clear that it's going to happen.
Well, it's kind of it's in its own way, it's sort of a Cinderella story.
Absolutely.
You know, which is, I mean, there has to be a Prince Charming, and, you know, there has to be the meritorious and lovely girl who's, you know, sitting in the, well, impoverished, who, you know, somehow, and there has to be some sort of fairy godmother. I think Aunt Dimity is certainly unique, and, you know, the fact that Laurie's never met her, and in fact nobody ever gets to meet her, ever, is an interesting part of the book.
Emma and Derek and Nell and Peter have met her.
Well,
because they live next door to her,
that's
but not
right.
on stage.
No, but that's what I meant. In real time, in the
Nope.
books, in the stories, you know,
Nope,
Aunt
she
Dimity is dead before we ever
a
start.
Very background character in her own way.
And
But she's a very important character. She's another character in the book, and she plays a role, and she's in all of the books. And Laurie comes to know her, and to learn a lot about her mother, learn about that world and herself. And
it's an extremely interesting narrative voice. You know, it's very seldom that any author can, in fact, I think, introduce a narrative voice as carefully as you have, and that's all we need to say about how it works, or we will spoil the surprise. But, you know, it's intriguing that somebody can be that powerful a figure in a series of books the way you've done it. I mean, there's a lot of artistry in there. I don't know that you deliberately set it out as a literary or artistic, you know, device, but it's worked extremely well. And right now, I find it interesting in fiction at the moment. There are a lot of people who are trying to achieve some kind of, I won't say unique, but different literary voice. I think The Lovely Bones, for example, using a child as a narrator to tell a really brutal story of a rape and a murder, and then the child looking down from, you know, after death, is one way of doing something interesting. And there's always the unreliable narrator, where you have an amnesiac, which many writers have used. You know, can you trust what this person's telling us, because in fact this person's memory is erased or faulty.
Yes,
yeah,
right.
unreliable. Or Todd Goldberg wrote a really wonderful book a year or two ago, and I'm trying to remember what it's called. I'm blanking the name slightly, but he had a character, and you're never sure whether the character is sane or delusional, and you know, is the reality that the character is describing to you delusion, or as a reader, you really kind of have to make election at some point in the course of the book who you're going to believe. You know, this narrator or everybody else.
Having read much science fiction and fantasy throughout my life, none of this is new to me. And it's gotten into the literary genre. And they're ripping off things that science fiction and fantasy writers have been doing since the 1940s, 1930s, really.
Right.
And so this is not new, and it's fun for you the way it's been fun for those of us who read science fiction and fantasy. It's for the same reason. It exercises mainstream. Your mind.
Yeah, it's gone mainstream, but I think a lot of it is trying to achieve distinction in the marketplace. Some of it may be that...
I agree. And for me, I didn't try to do anything. I think that some of us just have voices, and trying to come up with a formula for having a voice seems very sad to me. It seems very sad. I mean, if you're not writing in your own voice, then maybe writing isn't what you should be doing. Maybe you should be in marketing or something like that.
Sure.
I've never sat down and said, Laurie's going to sound this way, or Aunt Dimity is going to sound this way. That's the way they sound. That's the way they talk. That's how it comes out.
And this is what you hear in your head?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it hard to turn it off?
It can be very hard. It took about 3 novels to get any kind of control over those voices, because they're so happy somebody's listening. I mean, it sounds like you're possessed.